Speaking loudly, but I'll do my best. I see that it says on the sheet of paper that I'm going to talk about Phytophthora trials in Kirstenbosch. I am going to talk a bit about Phytophthora, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of the work we're doing in Kirstenbosch. But I'm going to speak more broadly on a project, a collaborative project that's been running with SAMBI and FABI, which is the Forestry and Agricultural Biotech Institute in University of Pretoria. And I'll talk broadly about plant health and the role that botanical gardens play in, supporting plant health research, and I'll talk a little bit about biosecurity best practices. So forests are increasingly under threat from invasive pests and pathogens globally. There's so many examples of things arriving in places and wreaking havoc, and I think PSHB is a really good example of a very major issue. I'm just going to see if this will work for clicking through slides. Maybe not. Looks like the laptop it is. I'm just not very good at standing still when I talk. Don't mind me weaving back and forward. I hope that you can also see the presentation okay. So the main reason that these things are popping up and causing problems around the globe is because we are moving things, and the movement of plants and plant products is the major way that these things are getting around the world, and especially wood packing materials and things like crates and dunnage and pallets. There are phytosanitary measures in place to try and reduce the risk that these things pose, so the pallets have to be treated, but despite this, there's still incidents where things will slip through. And South Africa has got quite strict rules about the importation of plant material, but a lot of countries, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, it's a free-for-all, and large containerized plants are being moved with soil between countries and across oceans. One of the big challenges that we face is that we can only regulate against organisms that we know cause harm. And most insects and microbes aren't really hugely damaging in their natural environment because they've co-evolved with their plant hosts, and they don't really want to kill all of their plant hosts because that's not in their interest. But when they're moved from one place to another, they encounter what they call a naive host, so it's never had a chance to build up any sort of resistance or way to defend itself from this. And a really good example is the emerald ash borer. So this is not known to be a pest in its native range, but it was accidentally introduced into the US from Asia in the early 2000s. Within 10 years, it had killed 100 million ash trees, and it's really threatening the survival of ash in that continent. So there's been this, a concept developed around what we call sentinel plants. And so sentinels are things that you can sort of see as almost a canary in a coal mine. It's an opportunity to spot things early. So where you have trees in urban environments where you've got lots of people moving, lots of goods being traded, if something arrives, there's a good chance it's going to find something suitable to establish on, and you will potentially pick it up early on as sentinels. The other way that we use sentinels is where we have exotic species planted. So here in South Africa we have a lot of exotic species, and we can look for what we call new host-pest interactions. So maybe some of our insects or some of our microbes that aren't a problem for our native plants, but if they jump onto these exotic plants, they can cause problems. And then we can use that to inform other countries and say, hey, we know that, okay, we've got oaks planted here. PSHB is a good example in that, even though it's not a pest that's native to South Africa, it's not managed to get to the native range of oaks or box elders yet. But we know very well from what we've seen here that if it did get to the native range of those trees, it's going to cause major problems. And then that means that those countries can start to really more strictly regulate against that pest. So I want to talk a little bit about biological invasions. The concept is not limited to any particular taxonomic group, but invasion science is focused largely on plants and animals. And so I guess you're probably all familiar with the concept of weedy plants, and there's a lot of regulations in place to try and deal with managing those invasions. But microbes in particular have generally really been, I guess, underrepresented in terms of studying biological invasions. I'm going to just give a few brief slides about some of the regulations and international conventions in place dealing with plant health and biodiversity conservation. I won't go on about this too long. I don't want to kill a nice Saturday morning. But in terms of plant protection, the IPPC is an international governmental treaty. It's signed by over 180 countries worldwide. It aims to protect the world's plant resources from the spread and introduction of pests. And the main tool that it uses to do this is international standards for phytosanitary measures. And that's things like what I mentioned before about having rules in place about how wood pallets need to be treated before they can be moved around. It's a sole global standard-setting organisation for plant health. The focus of the IPPC is predominantly on protecting plants that are economically important. So they're plants that we grow for food and also for wood products, forest products. They do have an objective that is linked to protecting the environment from the impact of plant pests, strategic objective B. So this addresses environmental concerns related to plant biodiversity and emerging problems associated with plant pests as invasive alien species. But despite this, the emphasis of their phytosanitary regulations remains very heavily focused on plants of economic importance. We've got another level of complication here because within the World Trade Organization, they have something called the Agreement of the Application of Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures. So this provides for plant protection within a trade agreement, which sounds like it might be an okay thing, but the problem is that the primary aim of the WTO is to promote international trade. And the aim of the SPS is actually to prevent countries from implementing protectionist trade barriers. So they really want to promote, they're more concerned with promoting trade rather than concerned with plant health. By contrast, we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, and this explicitly considers the natural environment, and invasive alien species are addressed under something called the Acquired Biodiversity Target 9. Pathogens affecting wildlife have often fallen into the cracks between these two regulatory bodies because you've essentially got a body concerned with plant pests, but for plants of economic importance, then you've got a body dealing with biodiversity conservation. But when it comes to invasive species, their focus is on invasive plants and animals. So we've got this real gap here. And as a consequence, microorganisms have really been significantly underrepresented in these invasive alien species databases. There is a recognition that there's this gap and that these two organisations should be working together to address this issue. So there was a memorandum of cooperation established to try and deal with this. There's not been a huge amount of activity happening in that realm in recent years, so there's probably a real need to sort of push and revitalise the communication between these two bodies. To be fair, microbes are really challenging to deal with in terms of them being invasive species. They're very small. We don't know much about their biodiversity and ecology, where they come from. They're just an incredibly huge group, so there's so much to deal with there. They're inconspicuous and often escape visual detection, which makes them really hard to intercept at border points. And like I said before, many of them were unknown to science prior to their establishment in a novel environment, where they then went on to cause really big problems. And to be fair, in terms of our understanding of invasive microbes, we know an awful lot more about microbes that act as pathogens or plant pests than we do about any other group of microbial organisms. So there's huge gaps in terms of our knowledge there. But the good news is that we have a lot of advancing technologies, including sort of molecular technologies, which is really increasing the visibility of these organisms. And we've got things like high-risk site surveillance for early detection, and it's giving us better opportunities to integrate plant pathology and invasion science. What have botanical gardens got to do with this? Well, botanical gardens and arboreta play a really important role as custodians of outstanding plant collections. And they also have a body of knowledgeable and passionate staff working in those collections on a daily basis. So they can assist in gathering evidence of the risks posed by pests and diseases to plant species globally. So there's a body called the International Plant Sentinel Network, and that sits under BGCI, and that was established to provide a platform to coordinate information exchange and support sentinel plant research within botanical gardens and arboreta, with the objective of functioning as an early warning system to identify new and emerging pest and pathogen risks. And in 2016, SAMBI established a sentinel tree project in South Africa. It's SAMBI funded, and it sits in Fabi. And I know I've lost my accent a little bit, but I am actually from Australia. So this was a project
we
that...
can tell that.
This was a project that brought me to South Africa in 2016. So the aim of the project was to use the IPSN as background to improve surveillance and identification of new and emerging pests and pathogen risks by using botanical gardens and arboreta as sentinel sites for tree health monitoring. The project is it's countrywide. We work in the SAMBI National Botanical Gardens, and then there's also some non-SAMBI gardens in Arboreta, and we've been engaging with Arderne for many years now. So these gardens house amazing collections of plants. There's a strong focus on growing and conserving indigenous South African flora as well, especially in the SAMBI gardens. But then adding the non-SAMBI gardens into it gives us a little bit more in terms of the exotic plants, and so that's why we've sort of added some of these non-SAMBI gardens to the project as well. So the main aim of the project has been to identify the unknowns. There's research opportunities to inform plant health, so we can increase our understanding in terms of the impacts of known pests and pathogens. We can identify new pest-host associations, and we have the early warning system. There's also been a lot of opportunities for capacity building work, so we've run quite a lot of training workshops and online webinars. We've been developing methodologies for monitoring and surveillance of plant pests and diseases in the gardens, and we've been working with the gardens to create standardised approaches for biosecurity best practice. And one of the outcomes of that has been through working with SAMBI's Horticultural Enrichment Forum to produce a guide to security best practice for living plant collections in South Africa. And one of the reasons that biosecurity is so important for people managing plant collections is that there's a number of routine activities that are conducted that makes them hotspots for the introduction and spread of pests and pathogens. So these activities include the movements of plants and plant material, as well as the mobility of staff, and then the visits that they have by millions of people each year, often from overseas. And especially in the case of somewhere like Kirstenbosch, people will get straight off the plane and go straight to Kirstenbosch, wearing the shoes and the clothes that they were wearing from the country that they departed. And if there's still soil stuck to their shoes, or potentially they could be carrying spores of things, they're going straight into an amazing plant collection. So we've generally just been trying to raise the awareness around biosecurity issues to the people working in those plant collections and managing those plant collections. So it's therefore vital that the staff involved in those gardens really consider biosecurity as an essential consideration for all their activities. It's also really important because many of these people are engaged in conservation projects outside of the gardens. So they'll be going from the gardens to remote locations to collect plants that they'll then be bringing back to the gardens. And so there's a risk that if they're going to other provinces, they'll be bringing something back from those provinces. We often have the concept of indigenous as something belonging to South Africa, but I think we need to start getting a bit more nuanced in that, because South Africa has many biomes, and a lot of these organisms would not be able to move from one biome to the other without us giving them a direct route there. And you might have an insect that is not problematic on the plants in its natural range, but you take it to another area, and especially when you're dealing with plants that are being managed in big plant collections, and again, the conditions that they're under in those managed gardens is very different to the conditions that they're in their natural environment. So there's risks for even within the country that we could be moving things around. But also for these people that are going to remote places, they need to make sure that when they're going there that their shoes are clean, their tools are clean, and they're not taking anything with them into those remote locations. And late last year, we ran a biosecurity best practice workshop. This was held at Kirstenbosch, and we had staff from a number of the other Sandby gardens attending, plus a few non-Sandby people. We had some sponsorship from the IPSN, and we managed to get an Australian Brett Summerall across the road as well. So he sits with the Sydney Royal Botanic Gardens, and he's doing amazing things there in terms of plant health research and biodiversity conservation research. So pests and disease outbreaks have the potential to cause damage within collections, but then they can also spread from there and threaten susceptible plant species at a national level. And so this is really important for botanic gardens because they're moving plant material on a regular basis, but they also often have very valuable and rare plant collections that they need to protect. Francoise already raised the topic of the Polyphagus shot-hole borer. It's a tiny little ambrosia beetle from Southeast Asia. We call it an ambrosia beetle because its food source is a fungus, and it's actually able to carry the fungus with it. And when it burrows into the trees, the spores of the fungus get deposited on one of the edges of its little tunnel. It colonizes those tissues, and then the fungus produces tiny little spores, and it's those spores that the beetles eat. In its natural range, like I mentioned, these things co-evolve with their hosts. They don't want to kill their hosts because then they're going to be out of a job and they're going to be out of existence. But what seems to happen is that when you bring these things to a new environment, you've you've got all these potential new hosts for it. And often you see things that, what we call congeners. So things that are closely related to something from its natural environment. And ACEs are a good example. So there's ACEs in Southeast Asia, and in its natural range it's probably not causing a problem on these ACEs, but it's now found a new ACER, an American one, box elder, and it's probably closely related enough to the Chinese ACEs and other sort of Southeast Asian ones that it recognises this as a suitable host. The fungus can establish really well in it, but there's a mismatch in that the tree is really susceptible to the fungus. The fungus causes disease in it. And this is where we're starting to end up with problems. I don't want to talk too much about it. It's a depressing topic, and there's lots of other exciting things to talk about. But essentially, the activity of the beetle, when it finds a host that it really likes, it goes crazy in terms of setting up all these galleries, and that also helps spread the fungus throughout the tree, and you end up with enough damage in these susceptible hosts that we see big trees killed sometimes in very short amount of time, and large numbers of beetles dispersing. There is a fair bit of work being done. What we really lack is a national strategy to help all the stakeholders manage this. At the moment, we are seeing small impacts in natural forest. There's concerns about some of our agricultural crops, like some of our deciduous fruits and pecans and avocados, but by far the biggest impact that we're seeing is in urban environments, and municipalities just do not have the resources to deal with this in the way that they need to. The City of Cape Town is doing an exceptional job in terms of actively trying to manage this. And this is not something that we're seeing in other municipalities across the country. There's no requirement for them to manage it at the moment, and so I think this is where the country needs to, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, together with Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, really need to get together and come up with a national strategy that has legislation underpinning it, and to assist municipalities to deal with this issue. That's all I want to say about that beast. There's a few other things ticking along in Kirstenbosch. There's a root-rotting fungus called Armillaria melia, which is unfortunately also here in Arderne. This is a fungus that comes from Europe. It was most likely brought here with the establishment of companies' gardens. It most likely came on potted plants that were brought in. And again, it's encountering naive hosts that don't know how to defend themselves against it. It causes a root and collar rot, and you get these fans of mycelium spreading up the trunk of the tree. We've seen Widringtonia quite heavily impacted by it. And there's a growing list of species. I don't know if you know the Van Riebrix hedge at Kirstenbosch, Brabagem, that's just slowly getting bowled over by it. So Phytophthora cinnamomi it's not a fungus, it's a water mold which behaves like a fungus. Again, introduced to South Africa. It was first recorded here, I think, in the 1930s as a problem on grapevines. We know that it's having a significant impact on Proteaceae in Kirstenbosch gardens, but there's not been a huge amount of research done on it in recent years in terms of the impact that it has on biodiversity. It's an issue for avocado growers. There's huge amounts of resources that get channeled into trying to find rootstock that are resistant, and then it's also actively managed in avocado orchards through using phosphite, which I'll talk about a little bit later again. In sampling the botanical gardens across the country, we've found a whole list of other Phytophthora species. A number of these are probably going to be native to South Africa and won't be problematic for our native flora here. But out of interest, we've picked up a couple of first reports for the country, so those involved, that's the first time that they've been recorded in South Africa. And also we've got a new species that's not known anywhere else in the world. So some of these can cause problems as taking out fine roots, and they're not going to kill the tree outright, but they're just nibbling away, and just another thing in the background that's putting stress on the tree, and it can lead to sort of twig dieback, and in more severe cases, whole branch dieback or entire trees dying. So I'm moved out of as being the postdoc directly working on the Sandy project in 2019, and we had a new postdoc come in for a couple of years, Ms. van Gosse. He's an entomologist. I've remained involved in the project, but in a bit more of a supervisory role. One of the things that he picked up in his term was a couple of cypress aphid species, Cynara cupressi and Cynara tejephalina. Cynara cupressi we knew was present in South Africa, but for the first time we saw it causing problems on Widringtonia species in Kirstenbosch. And Cynara tejephalina we also picked up on the Widringtonia, and it's the first official report of this aphid species in South Africa. So again, it just sort of shows that unfortunately botanic gardens are really good places to look for new pest and disease issues. Just a little sort of sidestep. We've been doing some work on the Clan William cedar. It used to be Widringtonia cedarburgensis, now Lelici. This is a critically endangered species, and the populations are declining. There's been changes in fire regimes. A lot of the trees were logged out, so there's all sorts of pressures on them. And we've been doing a little bit of work to understand some of the threats to them a bit more. There's also been active efforts to restore populations. There's a plantation in an area called the Reef, and they've been growing Widringtonia Lelici in nurseries and then taking them up to this plantation to re-establish them in the landscape. You can see all these dead ones here, so a fire came through. They're really susceptible to fire, like they don't survive. So often you see them growing in little gullies and areas that are a bit more protected, but with climate change and all sorts of other changes in the landscape up here, we're seeing hotter fires coming through more frequently, which is one of the things that's posing a huge threat to them. But while we were investigating the health of the trees in that area, we came across these aphids. And this is Cynara tejephalina, the one that we first picked up in the Kirstenbosch nursery. It's pretty unlikely that it's managed to make its own way into what is a reasonably remote location. So the most likely way that it got there, unfortunately, is by people trying to do the right thing and growing plants up and taking them up for a restoration project and inadvertently bringing a pest with those plants. So it really highlights the fact that when you're involved in restoration projects, you really need to be aware of the threats that can be associated with those projects. And there's systems that we want to put in place to help if people are taking plants out for restoration, that we can give them a quick screen and a visual inspection, but then also try and do some isolations to see if there's maybe more inconspicuous things sitting there, just to try and reduce the chances of things like this happening. We have a website that explains some of the stuff that we're doing with this project. If you go to the FABI webpage, even if you just Google FABI, that'll take you to the webpage, and then you can look for our Sentinel plant project page on the FABI website. This year we have a new postdoc starting in the role. He'll have a 2-year term, Felipe Belocchi. He's actually a Chilean. He's been in South Africa for a few years now. He was doing his PhD in FABI, but working on a disease in Araucaria native to Chile. And so I think he's going to bring some interesting stuff in this next phase of the project. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the NEMBA alien and invasive species list. Can I ask for a show of hands if you've heard of that? Okay, so these are, I guess it's, an act that's in place to manage alien and invasive species in South Africa. The list has got more than 380 plant species on it, so it's by far dominated by plants. There's a few mammals, there's a few birds, and there's some reptiles. If we look at microbes, there's a grand total of 7. But if we look at that a bit closer, 4 of these aren't present in South Africa yet. And one of the criteria for being on the NEMBA list is that something actually has to be present in the country. And if it's not present in the country, it should rather be on a watch list or prohibited list than this list. But if we dive a little bit deeper, 5 of those 7 microbes are only a problem on commercial forestry hosts, so either eucalypts or pines, and they're not a threat to our natural environment. So you could probably also make a case that they should be regulated under agricultural and forestry acts rather than be on NEMBA's list. But the only one that is currently on the list that really belongs on the list is Phytophthora cinnamomai. So there's been a bit of debate over the years about whether Phytophthora cinnamomai is native to South Africa or not. There was some work done in the 70s that showed that it was really well established across the Western Cape and even in areas that were quite remote, which led people to think that maybe it belongs here. It has an impact, but not an impact on a really massive scale like we see in the southwest of Australia. But I can tell you, hand on heart, it's not native to South Africa. We're pretty sure it's also from Southeast Asia, and it is causing problems here, and a lot of those problems are sort of going on unnoticed because no one's really looking. We have a global biodiversity hotspot here, just insane number of plant species with about 70% of them not occurring anywhere else in the world. More than 1,700 of those species are listed at being at some threat of going extinct in the wild. And that's quite a concerning number, and that together with the level of endemism that we have here has led to the Cape Floristic region being called the hottest biodiversity hotspot in the globe, which is not a great thing really. So the major threats that have been recognised are agricultural and urban expansion, changing fire regimes, and invasion by alien plant species. I'm going to jump back to Phytophthora cinnamomai. So as I mentioned, Phytophthora are water molds. They're not true fungi. They're in their own kingdom. They're really weird little things. In particular, Phytophthora cinnamomai causes root and collar rot. There's over 5,000 plant species that we know are susceptible. This is worldwide. And it managed to make it to the list of 100 of the world's worst invasive alien species. It's one of only 3 plant pathogens that are on that list. Where I'm from, in the southwest of Australia, Phytophthora cinnamomi is recognised as a key threatening process to our biodiversity. We call it the biological bulldozer. So we have, the Western Cape, we have a high level of species diversity and a lot of species that are endemic, and many of them are susceptible to Phytophthora cinnamomi. So it spreads really easily, and this can either be on its own by root-to-root contact from an infected plant to an adjacent plant, or by these tiny little swimming spores that it produces called zoospores that can move in surface and subsurface water flow. But animals can also spread it, but it's generally us that are most responsible for moving it over large distances by moving infested soil or infested plant material, or even the mud on our vehicle tyres or our footwear or tools. And once it's present, eradication is practically impossible. In the southwest of Australia, we see direct impacts in terms of decreased plant species richness, and we see indirect impacts where you see changes in canopy cover that leads to overexposure of understory species and changes in hydrology and nutrient cycling. And we also see decreases in the abundance of the fauna that use these susceptible plants for cover, food, or nesting. And there's numerous species at risk of extinction, and it's not just plants, so even little guys like these tiny little honey possums, they feed exclusively on the nectar of Banksias, and with those Banksias disappearing, its food source is disappearing. Because it's recognised as a key threatening process in Australia, there's active management, and this includes doing the work to understand what the relative susceptibility of all our native plants is to this pathogen. There's hygiene measures that are in place to try and stop it being moved into areas that are still clean. And we use something called phosphite, or phosphorus acid, for in situ conservation. So for more than 2 decades now, we've been using phosphite in our natural ecosystems to preserve the integrity of the plants. So phosphite won't kill the Phytophthora, but it gives the plants a bit of an immune boost, and that buys you time to collect germplasm for ex situ conservation projects. So back to our sort of Sambi Botanical Gardens project. Botanical gardens are really playing an increasingly important role in terms of biodiversity conservation. A lot of the horts working in the gardens are engaged actively in conservation projects. I'm going to talk about a little project that I got involved in. So there's a genus of Proteaceae called Saurocephalus. There's 11 species in the genus, and of those 11, 9 are endangered or critically endangered. And there's some global guidelines on what we should be aiming for in terms of representation of species in ex situ collections. And some people in the UK linked to BGCI did a desktop study of South African Proteaceae to see how well we're doing in terms of having that representation in ex situ collections. And Saurocephalus was identified as a genus that's not well represented in these collections, and it's considered to be horticulturally difficult. So that instigated a project to go and collect seeds and cuttings from this little plant. Like I mentioned, it's critically endangered. There's one extant population left in the Waterfowl Nature Reserve near Tulbagh, and it faces an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. One of the good things that South Africa has going for it is that there's a lot of work being done in terms of threatened species assessments. So for all the South African flora that's on the IUCN Red List, there's a very thorough assessment that's done to identify the threats. And the threats that have been identified for this species are habitat loss due to dam construction and forestry plantation. It's hard to believe that there's actually a great big pine plantation right next door to the largest remaining population of this critically endangered plant. Not a great idea. And also ongoing habitat degradation due to too frequent fires and invasion by alien plants. So October 2021, some of the Sambi guys together with crew and Cape Nature people went to this site to monitor the population and to hand pollinate some of the individuals. At the time they counted 62 living plants in the area. They went back in February to collect the seeds, and they'd noticed that the number of plants had dropped. There was a whole bunch of dead plants there. About 11 of them had died in those months that had passed. And so they asked me to come and join them on a trip in May to see if we could figure out what was causing the death. The population was down to 37. And it's very clearly Phytophthora cinnamomai that's causing those plants, causing the death of those plants. So we scrape back a bit of the bark here, and you can see this, what we call a lesion. So the Phytophthora comes in from the roots, it creeps up the stem a little bit, but it's causing very typical root and collar rot. We got it from every single sample that we collected, and we've just published this as the first report of this invasive pathogen threatening a critically endangered proteaceae. But it raises a lot of questions for what Phytophthora cinnamomai is doing in the landscape more broadly. So Phytophthora cinnamomai, as I said, is on the NEMBA list, but the risk analysis has not been done to support this listing yet. It's in the process of being done at the moment. It's one of the first things that Felipe's working on now that he's in the project. But we really need to better understand the threat that Phytophthora cinnamomai poses, particularly to our threatened flora. And there's other gaps there in terms of should we be considering listing additional pathogens that we know for sure are invasive, like Armillaria amelia, Ostreopuccinia I've put up there, but I haven't talked about. It's something called myrtle rust that impacts Myrtaceae. It's something that's also present in South Africa, but no one's really looking to see what it's doing. At first there was a bit of concern that maybe it would have an impact on eucalypts in plantation forestry, but it didn't, so it's like, oh well, that's good. And it's just gone quiet. So yeah, just some food for thought there. And I'm going to wrap up and just say that there's various organisations and many individuals that have supported the work that we've been doing in this space, and I'd just like to acknowledge all the support that we've had from them, and thank you again for giving me the opportunity to ramble on about plant health stuff, and thank you for your commitment and passion for plants.